Well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining. My name is Natalie James, and I'm the Coalition Builder for Prosperity Indiana. Some housekeeping for today's call. The call is being recorded, and feel free to drop any questions you have in the chat. After this call, we will send a follow-up email with all information as well as the recording, so you'll have that information there. For those of you who are new to the Indiana Assets and Opportunity Network, the ANO Network is a statewide premier network for asset building professionals that creates learning opportunities about policies and programs that affect low to moderate income families. And the network builds capacity for organizations aimed to increase financial stability. The network is co-led by Prosperity Indiana and the Indiana Community Action Poverty Institute, formerly known as the Indiana Institute for Working Families. And the network has a number of local partners, such as Homestead CS, Old National Bank, and Purdue Extension. Before I continue, I do want to mention that this will be my last ANO event, since my last week with Prosperity Indiana will be next week. It has been a pleasure to work with and learn from ANO Network members. And I hope that if you're on the call today and are not a part of the network, that you will continue to connect after this call to grow the asset building infrastructure across the state. Today's call is titled Building the Assets and Opportunities, COVID Recovery and Collective Opportunities for Growth. Today, we'll hear from a number of asset building professionals about the effects of COVID-19 on asset building work and ways that we can work through programs and policy to rebuild and apply best practices. Before we begin, we'll have a word from our ANO breakfast sponsor, AARP. Representing AARP today is Addison Pollock, the Director of Community Engagement at AARP Indiana. Since February 2017, Addison has worked alongside volunteers and community partners to advocate for public policies and initiatives that make communities more livable for people of all ages. He was born in Indianapolis and received his Master's of Public Affairs from Indiana University, Bloomington. He currently lives in the Irvington neighborhood with his wife, Abby, and their dog, Winston. Addison, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Natalie. I'm so glad that Winston got a shout out this morning, so appreciate it. It's good to be with you all. Good morning. It's great to have the opportunity to speak with you about AARP Indiana and our role in the Assets and Opportunities Network. For those who don't know, AARP Indiana is the state version of our national office. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan social welfare organization that empowers Hoosiers to live as they choose as they age. And while we have more than 820,000 members across the Hoosier state, our legislative and outreach efforts serve all 50 plus in the state of Indiana. And while the COVID-19 pandemic commanded AARP's attention in the arenas of public health and safeguarding safety in long-term care facilities, we never lost our urgency in promoting opportunities for financial security and protecting consumers. We continue these drumbeats as Hoosiers look for ways to bounce back, maintain, and grow their personal financial assets in this era of recovery. AARP sees itself as a wise friend and a fierce defender in financial resilience. So as a wise friend, we connect Hoosiers with best practices, tools, and resources to thrive in the job market, with things such as AARP's Resume Advisor and Job Board, manage debt better and save money for today and the future with latest articles and reports, as well as tools such as AARP's Interview and Advisor tool, so you know what questions to ask a prospective financial advisor. On the other end of the spectrum, we're a fierce defender. We advocate for legislation at the federal, state, and local levels. Here in Indiana, we're currently engaged in several state legislative efforts to strengthen the financial well-being of Hoosiers 50 plus today and in the future. Currently, we have commitment from Representative Van Natter to once again file a resolution urging the Legislative Council to assign an appropriate study committee to the topic of financial security in retirement. We are also engaged in an effort to stop Senate Bill 352 in its current form, which greenlights new consumer loan products that charge an interest rate of 36%, and when combined with charges and fees, can rise to nearly 300%, which you'll hear more about this later from our friends with the Hoosiers for Responsible Lending. And then finally, we're engaged on Senate Bill 236, which expands the current financial eligibility of people 65 years and older for a property tax deduction by increasing the adjusted gross income threshold and the maximum assessed value necessary to obtain a deduction on their property taxes. So AARP is committed to ensuring Hoosiers of all ages have options for a healthy financial future, whether in retirement or in the workforce. And we look forward to working with our valued partners in the Assets and Opportunities Network to promote these possibilities in the future. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Addison. And thank you again to AARP for sponsoring the breakfast. We really do appreciate having AARP as a partner in this work. Since this is a virtual breakfast and we're all missing out on the fun of in-person connection and real breakfast food, I'd like to give you all a delicious breakfast recipe from a Detroit-based chef who is really incredible and knows her way with biscuits and gravy. And so because we need a lot more spice these days, with COVID kind of putting a damper on everything, I'm dropping into the chat a link to the biscuits and gravy recipe. And if you all decide to give it a try, please let us know. We'd love to know how it came out. Before we get started with the panel for today, with today's presenters, I'd like our brains moving. So if you could get out a piece of paper and something to write with. I'll give you a moment to do that. Okay, on that piece of paper, draw a horizontal timeline from left to right. And don't worry, this is something that you'll keep for yourself, so don't worry about sharing it. At the beginning of the timeline, label it with the year you started doing asset building work, and label the end of it with the current year, 2022. Mark at the appropriate dates above the timeline 2 instances where you felt you helped remedy or worked toward remedying an issue that you signed up to do. And below the timeline, 2 instances where you felt like maybe you weren't as successful, or you felt a little less like you were able to help. The distance above and below the timelines correlate to how successful or unsuccessful you felt your experience was. The higher above, the more successful, and the lower below the timeline, the less successful. In addition to those 4 things, add 2 personal life events like births, deaths, wedding, graduations, etc. And in your personal time, identify common themes and the highs and lows. Throughout this breakfast, while you're listening and learning from our presenters, I want you all to ask yourself what lessons you learned from this analysis, and what common themes you continue to see as maybe you continue to add to this over time. And eventually your timeline may look a little something like this. And also feel free to share any themes that you, or any thoughts that you have in the chat. As we think about what we can learn from our past highs and lows, I'd like to share with you all some strategic goals that we have for the ANO Network in 2022. Last year, we spent time connecting with ANO members, as well as some of our asset building partners across the Midwest, about really best practices in the way that we can enhance the ANO Network. We had one-on-one conversations, we hosted webinars, and we really want to make sure that we enhance the experience of this network, so that anyone who joins really feels the value of being a part of the network. So the first thing that we'd like to do is increase the participation and membership in the ANO Network in order to increase geographic reach across the state, participation from practitioners, and diverse inclusion in the network. The second thing we'd like to do is provide opportunities for training and education for diversity of asset building topics, hopefully in person, COVID willing. Next, we'd love to create more partnerships with new and existing members. And then finally, we'd love to incorporate more equity in the recruitment, education, and training efforts of ANO. If you would like to join ANO or even learn more about the network, feel free to send me an email and I will drop my email in the chat and you'll get more information. Okay, up next we have Andy Nielsen with the Indiana Community Action Poverty Institute. Andy is Senior Policy Analyst with ICAPI and provides advocacy and research on consumer protections, tax, budget, and housing policy. Prior to the Institute, Andy worked at an Indianapolis community-based organization, Southeast Community Services, as a financial coach. And prior to this, Andy worked for several years in Washington, D.C., serving as a legislative assistant to the U.S. Senator Jeanine Shaheen and policy analyst for the U.S. Senate Committee on Small Business and Entrepreneurship and U.S. Congress Joint Economic Committee. He also worked as policy advisor to Governor Gina Raimondo of Rhode Island, and was an analyst for PNC Bank. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics from IU, and Andy will give an update on asset building related policy. Andy, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Natalie. Appreciate the introduction. Let's just get a second here to share my screen. Can we see this, Natalie? Great, thank you. So, as Natalie said, I'm Andy Nielsen, Senior Policy Analyst with the Indiana Community Action Poverty Institute. We just changed our name. You probably knew us before as the Indiana Institute for Working Families. So thank you so much for joining us this morning. My presentation and comments today are going to be focused really on what Addison talked about, and that was Senate Bill 352 here in the 2022 Indiana General Assembly. But to start off, on the federal side, this conversation is going to be more about predatory lending. On the federal side, the Hoosiers for Responsible Lending, which is a coalition of faith-based veterans, community-based organizations, social service providers, and other consumer advocates. We are co-chair of that coalition with Prosperity Indiana and are supportive of the federal level of the Veterans and Consumers Fair Credit Act, which would provide a 36% all-in rate on consumer loans that are unsecured. So it excludes things like first mortgages and auto loans, which typically already cover or have much lower interest rates. We have an original co-sponsor in our Indiana delegation, Representative Andre Carson, representing the 7th district, covering most of Marion County. But it is bipartisan legislation, and as a frame of reference, Indiana is just one of 25 states in the United States that doesn't have strong rate caps on predatory loans. So we believe that a all-in rate nationwide would provide certainty to consumers regardless of where they live, and also provide certainty to lenders and would create more efficiencies in the market. 36% there's a lot of history behind that, but it is the rate with which a lot of research has provided that consumers are still able to afford loans and lenders are still be able to earn a profit. It comes from a lot of research from the Department of Defense as they analyze readiness within active duty military, and the Military Lending Act was established in 2006, setting this 36% rate. So we are supportive of that at the federal level, but we know that is a much harder push, but we still are supportive of this and are working with our House delegation and our 2 senators, Senators Young and Braun, for broad support of that bill. Moving on. So if you have been hopefully you've been following a lot of the what's going on at the Indiana legislature this session. We know there are a number of controversial bills, but one that both ANO and Hoosiers for Responsible Lending have been following very closely is this Senate Bill 352.
Hey, Andy.
Yes.
Sorry, for the benefit of folks who just have one screen, can you go to presentation mode?
Am I not in that?
We're in your notes view, and so this is kind of small.
Oh, I apologize for that.
Thanks.
I'm sorry about that.
We went back to it.
Okay, how about this?
Yes.
Okay, I'm so sorry about that. I shared the wrong one. So yeah, thanks, Jessica. So Senate Bill 352 is a very complicated bill. Let's just say that. So we hope that this chart helps kind of illustrate what the bill is doing, and I'd like to also talk about what the bill doesn't do. So the bill is being talked about as a way to combat payday lending in the state of Indiana, but does nothing to address the current payday lending statute. So instead, it sunsets the current step-up rate, which is this lower left-hand corner that you see down this stair step rate, and eliminates that current provision and replaces it with this new product that, similar to the payday lending statute, would exempt these loans from criminal loan sharking, which kind of begs the question, why do we have a criminal loan sharking statute if our entire consumer credit code is then exempt from prosecution? And again, this is not a payday lending bill and does not eliminate the current payday lending statute. And all it really does is increase the cost of subprime lending in the state. And we know that subprime lenders serve communities that traditional banks and credit unions simply don't, where they do not exist and where they do not provide credit. However, we believe that all this bill does is raise the cost of credit without strong consumer guardrails, such as an ability to repay, indication that the payments on these loans aren't eating so much of a borrower's income, or that the borrower has to have any income at all. We are also concerned that as borrowers progress in these loans, that lenders will choose and push to aggressively refinance these loans as much as possible, allowing fees to rack up and fueling a debt cycle. What we're hearing a lot is that this is a way to address problematic online lenders who are illegally lending in the state of Indiana. And most notably, the proponents of this bill talk about tribal lenders. So tribal lenders, because of Tribal Sovereignty Act and related legislation, there are some complications there. And at the state level, there's very little that we can do. That is a federal issue that the CFPB does have purview over. But for lenders who are illegally operating as a tribal lender, there have been cases by previous attorney generals that we've been allowed to sue those lenders under criminal racketeering. And for lenders who are just run-of-the-mill installment lenders who don't have Indiana licenses, the Attorney General and the Department of Financial Institutions are able to go after those lenders and either revoke revoke a license if they're lending where they shouldn't be, or whether they're not allowed to, or address civil charge or press civil charges against those lenders. What we're concerned about is creating a new product that is purely being sold as a market-based solution to this problem is insufficient. We know that a workable solution could be out there, but it needs to be discussed in a larger conversation of how we address lenders who are doing things that they shouldn't do. Another piece is that despite these loans being very expensive, that competition will drive these lenders, will drive prices down for borrowers as lenders compete to earn that business. When we're talking about subprime borrowers, and especially if we're talking about subprime borrowers who are in emergency situations, we know that they don't have a lot of choices. Currently, under the payday lending statute, we know that payday lenders are charging the maximum allowable fees and interest because they know that their customers have no other options but payday storefronts. So logic would follow that a new product where this is the only option for the borrowers who we're talking about, borrowers in the subprime market or the alternative finance market, the idea that they will be able to, in a bind or in a pinch, will be able to shop around when this is their only option, violates competitive markets and violates economics, really. So that's something that we're really combating, that borrowers will be able to collectively help bring these rates down when this is their only option. And when we talk about, especially for borrowers who are, the subprime of the subprime, really no credit history or very, very, very poor credit history. The way that this bill would restructure our consumer credit code is would require borrowers to take out multiple loans over multiple lenders to meet larger credit needs. So if you think about a borrower who needs goes to a buy here, pay here car lot, well, this bill would limit the credit for those such loans, and borrowers could pay 2 and 3 times what's currently allowed under law to obtain these loans. But the bill as currently written does not allow borrowers to build credit. These loans could be applied for secured and unsecured lines of credit, right? So for buying a car, or just for I need $400 to fix a furnace or to address another emergency. And we believe that collectively it's a very problematic bill that doesn't do anything to help borrowers, to help consumers, to help create a bridge from subprime to prime, to help borrowers repair their credit. And it's for those reasons that we've been working really hard to fight this bill. And so far, while the bills continue to move, I believe we've been successful in making a case and pointing out just how problematic this bill is. And so there will be time at the end for questions. I don't want to bore people too much with the details, but as we've been working with lawmakers, something that we've put together, this is a snapshot of a lawmaker who sits on the House Financial Institutions Committee. So the bill is out of the Senate now, over in the House. They have until next Tuesday to hear the bill, and I'll point to some ways for which you can help. They have next Tuesday to hear the bill, or else the bill would die. So something we've been providing the lawmakers who sit on the House Financial Institutions and Insurance Committee is a debt profile of Hoosiers who live in the counties and the districts they represent. So this, why we say this is for a district, obviously we don't have the precise district level data, but this is a good proxy of just how pervasive debt is in Indiana and how solutions, as we're building credit, as we're providing new credit options, need to allow borrowers to, move out and more responsibly handle debt, and not just add to an already growing burden of debt in the state. We know that subprime online borrowers have a median income of $36,000, and those who are going to storefronts have median income of just $22,000, so below the federal poverty level for a household of three and four. So this is just a preview of this. If you go to the Institute's website, we have these profiles for all members of the committee right now. But just something to point out that as we're talking with lawmakers, really illustrating the problem and what the solution needs to be focused on. So how A&O can help. So we have a letter right now. I know many on this call have already signed based on their organization and personally in opposition to this bill. But I know that was shared in a reminder for today. But again, if you could please sign this letter as soon as the end of the day today, so that we can get that letter out to lawmakers indicating our opposition to 352. And if you haven't already, or if you have, continuing to do so, to reach out to your specific representative and to representatives of the House committee that will hear this bill and reiterate some of the points that we've made today and some of the points we have online of how problematic this is for Hoosiers and their families. So this is just a bunch of information, some tips and tricks of be sure to reach out to their staff when you reach out to them, because that helps ensure that the member will actually receive that note. So I know we'll have questions at the end, but Natalie, back to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Andy. And the issue of predatory lending is an issue that the A&O really does seek, the A&O network really does seek to remedy through education of our members. So thank you so much for sharing. And we will have questions at the end, but feel free to drop any questions in the chat for Andy, and he'll be able to answer them there. Next up, we have Marshawn Wally, who is president and CEO of Black Onyx Management, an applied research firm and management consultancy specializing in advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion. Trained as a stratification economist, Marshawn is also a certified diversity executive, certified fundraising executive, certified financial marketing professional, and a certified community development block grant administrator, as well as a Six Sigma Green Belt. He holds an MBA from IU Kelley School of Business and an MPA from Yale School of Public and Environmental Affairs. He has a master's degree in philanthropic studies from the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy and a master's of science in economics from IU. Recognized as a thought leader on public policy and diversity, equity, and inclusion, he has a weekly column in the Indianapolis Recorder and a monthly column in the IBJ Forefront. He is also a contributing op-ed writer for the Indy Star and is a proud dad of Alexander Wally. Marshawn believes if you want something you have never seen before, you must do things you have never done before. Marshawn, the floor is yours.
With all those degrees, I never learned how to use the mute button. So there's always that. Thank you, Natalie, for the introduction. And now I have to live up to all of those things. Very pleased to have the opportunity to talk with you all today. We are working on a key challenge facing our community. And we think it's really an opportunity. When you look at the Indianapolis disparity study that was recently done in 2019, being Black in Marion County is statistically linked to earning less, whether you control for education, age, marital status, and a whole host of other factors. Before the pandemic, Black businesses in the state of Indiana had a 40% closure rate. And so those are the headwinds. But at the same time, Black businesses in Indianapolis were known to have higher business receipts than average businesses in other communities. And Indianapolis at one point was ranked as high as number 3 as best places for to start a business, a Black business, back as late as 2006. Some of that has changed. And so part of what we see is an opportunity to develop a Black-led community development financing institution to advance the development of Black businesses in the community. In 1821, the first Black business was formed. It was a barbershop, and barbershops create community. And so we are launching Equity 1821 with $1 million from the city. I have an amazing team. It's always important to have people who are smarter than you on your team. Tamara Cypress is a Fortune 500 caliber employee. She's worked in a number of sectors in Fortune 500 companies, from communications to DEI to corporate social responsibility. Marilee Springer is our lawyer and consigliere who has a national practice on financial institutions. There's Joe Hansen, who's Senior VP of Strategic Initiatives, longtime banker, now doing excellent work over at INHP, doing creative things. Then Latoya Badaran is CFO, COO of the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership. She was a CPA and had a practice earlier in her career on examining financial institutions. Of course, there is a board, and I think we have a wonderful board. We have, Tony Mason with the Urban League, Tanya McKenzie with Indiana Black Expo. Willis Bright is our board chair. He's chairman of the African American Coalition of Indianapolis. I should note that Tony and Willis are leading a $100 million quality of life initiative, which calls for the development of a community development financing institution. Phil Johnson is treasurer of Eli Lilly Corporate. Nick Bontrager is a banker with over 25 years of financial services experience. Greg Hicks is CFO of the Indy Black Chamber. And then Robert Shagag with the Indianapolis Recorder is the CEO of Indianapolis Recorder Charities. Latoya Badaran, I mentioned her earlier, she's on the board. And then Jeff Bennett with the City of Indianapolis also rounds out our board. So I mentioned some of the headwinds, but I also like to focus on the possibilities, and that's really where we are on this project. And we think that the opportunity is to start a CDFI loan fund in Indianapolis, partner with Black serving organizations, focus on job creation and business formation. Those are key in part because Black Indianapolis is roughly 290,000 people, roughly almost the size of Fort Wayne, so roughly the third largest city in the state, had double-digit unemployment for between 2010 and 2020. And Indianapolis is 55th out of 85 metros in Black business formation. And so we think both job creation and business formation are important. We also just want Black businesses to be competitive in the market. Research suggests that Black businesses start in sectors that are more competitive. They have quarter five forces issues for the business. And so we want to make sure that we're getting into different industries. So we think that is an important part of this opportunity as well. But we also looked at the numbers and we did a deep dive. We had a partnership with Brookings, and we learned that there was roughly 705 Black businesses with employees in the 9-county region. That's roughly 2.4% of the 34,000 Black businesses in the area. If there were parity relative to our population in that 9-county area, we'd have 5,800 more Black businesses. If these Black businesses earned revenue comparable to non-Black businesses, a difference of 1.7 million on average to 8.2 million, there'd be an additional $44 billion in revenue in that community. If we hired more employees, so if we had, on average, Black businesses create about 19,000 jobs compared to 28,000 jobs. If there were parity, we'd have about 6,300 more jobs created within the region. If we paid the same, if there were parity in the amount of pay, Black businesses pay around on average $24,000, which would be significantly below the median income for Indianapolis, Marion County. Black people have the lowest median income in Indianapolis, Marion County. But if they had parity with non-Black businesses as far as employee pay, that's an additional $25,000, or that bump folks up to $49,000. In aggregate, that could be an additional $340 million in payroll in the community. When you put all these things together, and we recognize that there's a lot of ifs in this analysis, that's $52 billion and potentially 170,000 jobs when you multiply everything and put it all together. So we think that if we just take on 10% of this, $5.2 billion, roughly 17,000 jobs inside of a decade, then we are being bold and audacious. Meta, which is a CDFI, minority-led CDFI in Minnesota, roughly did $1 billion in lending in 30 years. So we do recognize that we have our work cut out for us, but we have the advantage of the lessons that they've learned. And we're hoping to be very aggressive and assertive in our goals. So CDFIs, why did we choose a CDFI and what are the different kinds? We believe that given the credit profiles, the prospects for businesses, the self-reported prospects for businesses, and really just the need in our community, create an opportunity to leverage community development financing institutions, which are mission-focused institutions that are designed to deal with riskier profiles. They're not going to handle the full life cycle of a business, but they will help get businesses into the traditional financial system. We believe that a community loan fund presented the best opportunity, especially if you set it up as a nonprofit. It would allow us to get resources from both government, nonprofit, as well as the for-profit sector. And it had the lowest barriers to entry as far as setup and creation. We are not the only ones thinking like this or doing this. There's an organization called the African American Alliance of CDFI CEOs. We've been engaged with this organization. They're essentially a trade association or advocacy group for CDFI CEOs. African American led CDFIs face some unique challenges in the market. And so we thought that it would be important to connect with them as we began our process. And so we've been having regular communications and are proud to be affiliated or working with them as a partner. I think it's important to note that Black-led doesn't mean Black only. We believe that the Black business segment is underserved. national research suggests that the penetration of CDFIs into the Black business market is only around 7% nationally. We did a survey statewide, and we noted both in the Indianapolis market and statewide, those numbers were similar. They didn't really get over 10%. And roughly you're looking at, when we looked at certified businesses, so these are businesses that are certified by the city or state. As a part of the certification process, you have to create financial statements and other reports, which would be similar to going through a loan process. We noted that upwards of 60% of Black businesses that are certified in the city of Indianapolis have never applied for a business loan. And the data suggests there's just concerns about credit risk or credit rates. There is a little bit of debt aversion, but some of it is just the onerousness of the process and just weak banking relationships that we believe a Black-led financial institution is positioned to overcome. And we believe that, again, because of the research on Black-led financial institutions or minority-led financial institutions believe that community banking relationships become very important. When you think about the 5 C's of credit, a lot of it is numbers, but some of it is also qualitative. And so having an understanding of the reputation of an individual in a community, understanding a little bit more about them than what's on paper, allows for a CDFI to try to work harder to get to yes in the appropriate instances versus just dismissing someone as a risk that can't be financed or funded. We, as I guess I've been talking a lot about research. So this is a poll that we did with Black Businesses Matter, which is an initiative my company launched. It was really more about marketing and earned media. We've established in all of the research that access to capital is a major challenge, but we also appreciate that there has to be education and training along with capital. And so what the CDFI allows us to do, particularly with our partners, is have training and education as well as the financing that really creates a symbiotic relationship. I mentioned Meta. Meta, when they started out, they were a management consultancy that eventually moved into financing. And what happens is you have an organization that understands a business deeply. And when it gets to the underwriting part, they just have intuitively knowledge about that organization that allows for better financing outcomes. But we know that the problem isn't just access to capital. So what's the plan? Start a CDFI loan fund in Indianapolis. We would expect to grow over time. We believe partnering with banks is going to be key to growth. Job creation initially will be the key objective. Black businesses have approached us, prominent Black business leaders have approached us about creating a mezzanine fund. I think we'll look at some other form of financing, but some kind of business formation fund would come later in a later stage of the project. But we also definitely want Black businesses to be an economic driver. And so we believe the training that's involved with that with the CDFI will help with competitiveness. So where we are, we will be filing our IRS filing. So you have to do the 501(c)(3) filing and then lend money for a period of time, and then apply for the CDFI designation, which is a federal designation with the CDFI fund. And so our primary mission will be to serve Black businesses, but we do intend to provide services to everyone. And so we're stepping through the process of getting the paperwork created and established for us to be able to do that. Again, our target audience will be Black businesses, but we will be serving all small businesses in need. I think it's important to note that one of the additional reason why we're targeting Black businesses is because in order to get to CDFIs now, when you're trying to overcome the challenge of getting to a CDFI, you either have to go to a bank and be turned down, and then or have an accountant or lawyer that it suggests that you go to a CDFI. Upwards of 90% of our businesses are sole proprietor, but they want to grow. They may not have an accountant, they may not have a lawyer, and they're with weak banking relationships, they're not even likely to go to a bank to apply to get a loan. And so we feel like this is a unique space in the market that we can target and specialize in that can have a really a remarkable benefit for the community. Major partners, I mentioned the folks who are on the board, but just wanted to revisit those and highlight them. As far as training partners, Indiana Black Expo and the Indianapolis Urban League become critical, as well as the Black Chamber. My company also supports the Indianapolis Urban League Entrepreneurship Center, so there's natural synergies there. Very interested. The CICP has also come on board as a partner, as a part of their Business Equity for Indy initiative. And so we believe we have the right partners at the right time. The city has stepped forward to provide $1 million. And that is my time. I appreciate the opportunity to be here to present to you all. And I will stop now and let folks ask questions a little bit later.
Thanks so much, Marshawn. And we do have another minute for questions if anyone has any questions at the top of your mind. I'll pause here to see. Okay, then feel free to drop any questions you may have in the chat. And again, at the end, we will come back to questions. Thanks again, Marshawn. Really awesome learning about this new CDFI opportunity. Really excited to see and contribute to the work of Equity 1821. Thank you so much for sharing. Next up, we have Brian Rakovitis, who's the Director of Economic Inclusion at the Community Economic Development Association of Michigan. Brian oversees the execution of CEDM's economic inclusion work, which aims to create inclusive systems that creates more pathways to lift people across the state out of poverty. His work includes coordinating the Children's Savings Accounts Network and the Michigan Economic Impact Coalition, as well as supporting the Show Me the Money Day and the Midwest Asset Building Conference. Brian provides technical assistance and coordinates advocacy efforts for members and partners seeking to implement these programs. Before joining CEDM in 2017, Brian served as an AmeriCorps member through CEDM's Michigan Foreclosure Prevention Corps at United Way of Washtenaw County. After his service in AmeriCorps, Brian stayed on at United Way as a financial empowerment specialist. There, he focused on economic mobility, managed their VitaTax program, and was part of the mobile financial resource team that provided education, coaching, technical assistance, and training to nonprofits interested in taking on financial stability work. Brian received his Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Anthropology and his Master's of Public Administration from Eastern Michigan University. Today, Brian will discuss the Midwest Asset Building Conference and the work that CEDM has done to move towards COVID-19 recovery in Michigan. Brian, the floor is yours. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you for that long and warm introduction. I really appreciate it. So like Natalie said, I'm Brian Rakovitis. I'm the Director of Economic Inclusion at CEDM. And so just for background context, CEDM is, we're a nonprofit trade organization that serves Michigan's community economic development industry, and we have more than 300 members statewide. And like Natalie mentioned, my role is to lead our economic inclusion initiatives. And one of the work that I do there is to help plan and coordinate the Midwest Asset Building Conference. So I'm really excited to come here and share this with you all today. Some of you may have attended the 2017 conference in Indianapolis, or perhaps the 2019 conference in Detroit. But the Midwest Asset Building Conference is held every other year in a different Midwest state. So it moves from state to state, and following a one-year hiatus because of COVID and just not looking to do another virtual conference. I'm happy to share that the 2022 conference will be held in St. Paul, Minnesota on June 28th and 29th. And we'll be providing both in-person and a fairly robust virtual experience. So there's an opportunity to engage and come to St. Paul or engage virtually. So I've had the distinct honor or fortunate opportunity to help plan this conference since 2017, although admittedly in a very minor capacity in 2017, so I just joined CEDM a few months prior to it actually kicking off. But for those who are new to the conference, or perhaps maybe coming back to this idea after a few years, the conference is really designed to allow organizations from across the Midwest to come together and really advance asset building opportunities for low income and marginalized communities. It provides us with the space to talk about the importance of collaboration, to share our collective stories, and to really rise up voices that might not otherwise be heard. CEDAM actually, we had the honor of leading the 2019 conference, which was hosted in Detroit. And, as this conference has evolved, we've really focused and centered on closing the gender and racial wealth gap. And I think, especially our keynote speakers, Queen Quet, chiefess of the Gullah Geechee Nation, and Ann Price, president of the Insight Center, who were doing both our opening and keynote our opening and lunch keynotes, respectively, for the first day, really helped to not only ground us in kind of the historical and continued struggle of both, and not only African Americans, but marginalized communities, but really helped us to understand that by coming together and by lifting up, marginalized communities, we actually all benefit. And so there's this really great opportunity to think about and sort of challenge ourselves internally to think about our work and to reflect on how we can and should be working to close that gender and racial wealth gap. In addition to focusing on that, there's lots of opportunities to think about, asset building in the rural sector, asset building for, neighborhood and neighborhood associations. So there's a lot of just sort of different areas and spaces that that folks can engage with. And I do want to quickly share the link to the website so you can get more details, as well as share my screen for the Midwest Asset Building Conference, because just this morning we did open up, and I'm having a little trouble clicking on the button, got a couple of things popping up. There is now the speaker RFP. So we are, seeking feedback from folks that are interested in presenting during the conference. And we do have three sort of main main sort of conference tracks. That's policy, programs, and possibilities. So that first track around policy is really thinking about sort of those active policy efforts that are going on across your states, or advocacy efforts. And we've provided some examples like fines and fees, payday lending reform, which, as we know, is a major topic today, the lasting impacts of redlining. So really thinking about housing, lending, and asset building. In track 2, we have programs. So this is really thinking about the practitioners that are doing the work on the ground. So you all who are here today, who are engaging with individuals, working with direct service. So, whether it's financial capability and you're doing free tax prep and engaging around the CTC or the expanded EITC, or thinking about, those wraparound services that help individuals succeed within whatever sort of programming they're working on, housing, income supports. We encourage you all to apply. And then the last track is really about possibilities. And this is, the first two tracks, of course, are very, very important, but I'm really excited about the third track because I really think this is the essence of the conference. And this is those big ideas, those innovations where we think the field should be going. Maybe it's not, unlike with a policy space where you might have widespread policy diffusion of ideas, these are new or ideas that are really gaining traction over the past few years. So this is that opportunity to really think bold and to be bold in sort of ways to engage within the asset building space. And so I encourage you all to check this out. And of course, it's midwestassetbuilding.org, and you can find details there. We have already provided some information about the conference. Registration will be opening in March. There's information on locations and accommodations that are close to the conference hall, which will be at the St. Paul River Center. So that's all provided there with a map. And of course, there will be support from our conference planning team to help you with any additional questions you have around accommodations. And then, of course, we have our partners listed, including the City of St. Paul, Indiana Assets and Opportunity Network, CDOM, and MinCap, and as well as the Ohio CDC Association, with additional partners that will be added shortly. So we've got a great team from multiple states that are helping to plan this, and we just really encourage you all to attend, as well as reach out to be a speaker. So I'll stop sharing my screen there, and I guess kick it back to you, Natalie.
Thanks so much, Brian. And my one question is, when did you say RFPs are due for folks who'd like to be speakers?
Yeah, wonderful question. As I go ahead and double check in my email to make sure I've got the facts for that. So the RFPs are due on March 9th. So a little less than a month, about 3 weeks to submit submit responses.
Okay, awesome. And again, after this breakfast, we will send out a follow-up email with all of this great information. So you'll have a link directly to the RFP if you'd like to speak during the conference, which we're really, really excited about. Thank you so much, Brian, for sharing today. Really appreciate it. Finally, up next, we have a presentation from Prosperity Now. And representing Prosperity Now is Alejandra Montoya Boyer, who is the Director of Policy at Prosperity Now, where she oversees the development and implementation of federal, state, and local policy that seeks to improve economic opportunity for Black and Indigenous people of color and low-income households. Alejandra specializes in developing and advocating policies to create a more equitable tax system, putting BIPOC on a path to homeownership, and building inclusive ecosystems for small business owners of color, and ensuring financial well-being for families and communities of color. Prior to Prosperity Now, Alejandra was the Associate Program Director for the Resilient Economies and Communities team at the National Association of Counties. In this role, she oversaw the REC program team and portfolio seeking to enhance county leadership in equitable recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and advance economic opportunity, mitigating multi-generational poverty, and equipping county leaders to effectively tell the stories of their communities to shift the narrative of the experience of poverty. She has a diverse background in policy, political campaigning, grassroots advocacy, and program management, with a deep content expertise in workforce development, economic justice, and racial equity. Alejandra calls Albuquerque, New Mexico home. So thank you so much for joining us with the time difference. We really do appreciate it. And she's a fan of the best green chile, hot air balloons, and hikes up the Sandia Mountains. Her pronouns, she, her, and ella. Alejandra, the floor is yours.
Good morning, buenos dias. Thank you so much. It's so strange to hear your own bio read back, and I was like, oh man, it's long. Anyway, let me pull up my screen and I will just give a brief introduction on Prosperity Now. Many of you already know, may already know our organization, but our mission is to create a fair, just economy that is free from struggle and racism, and an economy where everyone can fully participate across their life cycles, where households can build sustainable wealth through generations, and communities can prosper without exception. So my presentation is going to quickly cover kind of some larger national landscapes and analysis of what's happened where we were pre-pandemic, what's happened with the pandemic in terms of economic inequities, and then go into some policies and programs that can potentially help us recover. I have a ton of slides because we're including a lot of our research, but I do want to make sure, one, I'm not going to read everything, but we will share this afterward for anyone that's interested. But just to give a quick picture of pre-pandemic, we know that wealth inequities, and particularly racial wealth inequities, did exist before the pandemic. They've been since exacerbated. But in particular, we at Prosperity Now use what's known as liquid asset poverty as a standard measure. That means that the amount of people that can afford 3 months of savings. So pre-pandemic, 45 million households did not have enough cash to weather an emergency. That's 4 in 10 households. And as this graph here shows, it really is deeply, there's a deep inequity across race, that Black and Latinx households are particularly at risk of weathering any type of emergency. In Indiana specifically, 37.5 Indiana households were living in asset poverty, liquid asset poverty before the pandemic. And that's about the national average. 22% of workers were in low-wage jobs, which we know were at the greatest risk during the pandemic. 46% of Indiana households were rent cost burdened, meaning that their rents were more expensive than their incomes, and 19% of homeowners were cost burdened before the pandemic. These infographics just give a quick picture of the national racial wealth gap before the pandemic. Prior, we see obviously massive differences between white wealth at average of about 171,000 versus Black and Latinx wealth at 17 and 21,000 respectively. Homeownership rates, which is another strong measure of the racial wealth gap, also seeing great disparities. 72% of white households own their own home, or excuse me, 72% of homeowners were white, versus 41% Black. And again, all of this data is pre-pandemic. In Indiana specifically, we're seeing, again, the liquid asset poverty rate is particularly stark for households of color, in Indiana, particularly for Black households. Income poverty rates are also much higher for Black and Latinx households than they are for white households. And then over time, we're seeing homeownership in white homeownership is always higher. And it also, interestingly, it basically stays the same. There's very little fluctuation, including directly after the housing crisis in 2008, versus households of color have much greater fluctuation, particularly Indigenous, Black, and Latinx households. So we really are seeing some deep inequities that happen across the board. And of course, the pandemic has only exacerbated this. So particularly focusing on employment and housing, we know that housing rate or employment rates and job rates have improved. And in fact, for white men, they have basically gotten back to pre-pandemic rates. But that's not really the case for Black and Latinx workers. Black and Latinx workers still remain unemployed at much higher rates. And what's really interesting is that we're seeing deep disparities for Black and Latina women. So Black and Latina women were hit the hardest from the pandemic for a number of reasons: access to childcare, access to support systems to be able to maintain employment throughout the pandemic, including having jobs that allow for remote work, exactly as we're doing here, versus being on the front lines, being in service industries, and with jobs that require in-person. Since February 2020, 168,000 Black women and 61,000 Latinas have left the workforce. Those numbers are no longer included in unemployment rates. So the data and the picture that we see told, that story told in the national media, is actually not quite the full picture. And over 1 million women have actually left the workforce. And so knowing that these issues are being experienced, knowing challenges with childcare, with unemployment, we really are seeking targeted workforce solutions. We are also seeing a widening racial homeownership gap from the pandemic. Black and Latinx homeowners fell behind on their mortgages at much higher rates. And surprisingly, the national gap between Black and white homeownership rates was at its worst in 2020 for the full 20th century, or since the 20th century. They've increased. So before I mentioned that white homeowners had 72% homeownership versus 41% Black homeowners. And that's actually increased, or that disparity has increased. So the pandemic has had stark impacts on the racial wealth gap. We know that the people that have been most impacted are Black and Latinx people, women, immigrants, particularly undocumented workers. And then there's all of the people living at the intersections of those identities. Undocumented workers in particular were barred from many COVID relief programs and access public benefits. And I'll actually be talking about a guaranteed income pilot in just a few minutes that specifically targeted undocumented workers. But the point that I'm trying to make in the picture that's critical to gain here is really that though the pandemic had deep economic impacts across the board, we really are seeing that the picture for the most marginalized people is so much starker than anybody else. That though we're seeing recovery among, as I mentioned, white male unemployment has rebounded back to its pre-pandemic rates, whereas other communities are not seeing those types of realities. In Indiana specifically, there's just a graph to show that Black and Latinx households, particularly households with children, lost employment at greater rates, leaving them at increased housing insecurity, higher eviction and foreclosure rates, and greater food and health insurance insecurity. We did, in partnership, the Prosperity Now was able to conduct some pandemic research around the impacts of debt during the pandemic. It was a small study. We were interviewing BIPOC folks that saw increases in their financial hardships and the impact that debt would have on their circumstances. I'm not going to go through all of this, as I said, just to give a quick picture. All of the participants were Black, Indigenous people of color. They were predominantly women, and they were all low-income families. These are the types of debts and that these types of families had, and really just going through a couple of findings that we were able to pull out that. Obviously, insufficient income can lead to participants taking on significant debt. Debt experienced by BIPOC low-income families is because of credit rates, access to services, access to financial institutions. It means that these types of debt tend to be more predatory, tend to have worse interest rates, and have significant issues for these families. Many of the participants said that they were particularly worried about their own health or safety for their family, and needed to take out debt and have access to finances for this reason. Many participants relied on family and friend loans. Car loans were a particular challenge for many families. And then obviously credit cards. Many people had to put their basic needs and necessities on credit cards, meaning that families will have to continue to pay off that debt at particularly high interest rates over the course of to the next decade. So I'm just going to skip through this. A lot of this is just showing the different findings that we had from this project. Many households were able to gain access to some types of support through cash assistance from nonprofits, COVID relief programs, local nonprofits, and the resources that they were providing. But all of the participants said that this wasn't enough to maintain financial security and overcome barriers throughout the pandemic. So really all of this is really just showing us that the economic fallout of COVID-19 is going to have lasting impacts for years, maybe decades. And we're particularly seeing that with low-income, BIPOC, immigrant, and women-led households. And so now I'd like to talk through what policymakers and programmatic practitioners can do to offset these challenges. So first, we saw the child tax credit, which was expanded under the American Rescue Plan. With that expansion, it meant that families were able to access their credit on a monthly advance payment system. It also ensured that the lowest income families were able to access it by making it refundable. 27 million children, disproportionately Black and Latinx children, were able to gain access to the credit by making it refundable. In 2021, we were able to see an almost 45 decrease in child poverty. That's particularly decreasing child poverty amongst Black, Latinx, and Indigenous children. Though the extension or the expansion of this credit was actually ended in December 2021, meaning that we're at risk of 10 million children falling back into poverty. The majority of those kids are Black and Latinx. This is just a quick graph that shows what Indiana families in particular were using their child tax credit for, food being the largest expense, school expenses, essential bills, et cetera, really indicating that despite some of the national narrative, these types of credits and resources for families are used for essentials. This isn't going toward expensive, unnecessary goods. It's not going towards any other types of things than basic necessities for families. Knowing the challenges at the federal level, we are seeing an increase in state expanded child tax credits. And in Indiana, there is a Senate Bill 234, that hopes to create a child tax credit for the state of Indiana. While Indiana currently does not have a child tax credit, there is an earned income tax credit, which does provide families with low-income families with resources. But we are hoping to see an increase in statewide child tax credits, and we're definitely pressuring the federal government to extend the expansion from ARP, knowing how much impact this had on low-income BIPOC families. Next, just covering a couple of things that we focus on for access to affordable housing, knowing how critical it is to make sure that families have access to housing. Things like down payment assistance programs, which can ensure that first generation and first time home buyers have access to the resources to be able to pay for home ownership, recognizing the value of owning your own home and closing the opportunity to close the racial wealth gap. Indiana does have a first-time home buyers credit or first-time home buyers down payment assistance program, and it is coupled with home ownership counseling to ensure that owners are able to retain their homes. There's other types of innovations that we're working on, things like direct rental assistance and zoning reforms to make sure that we are able to offer affordable housing to all people, and particularly to curb the impacts of displacement and gentrification. Next, I'm going to go through one of our keynote policies, baby bonds. So baby bonds was introduced and mostly popularized by Derek Hamilton, who's an economist out of the New School. It was introduced at the federal level by Senator Cory Booker, and during his presidential candidacy, there was some attention, though a lot of folks still don't fully realize what baby bonds are. So what they are, they're a significant monetary investment of children, specifically focusing on future wealth building. This policy is a specific opportunity to narrow the racial wealth gap, recognizing that the largest investment will go toward the lowest wealth households that are disproportionately BIPOC. This is just a pretty infographic we have showing how baby bonds actually work. There's a significant investment from the government at birth. Those investments grow over time. And then at 18, kids have access to those financial investments to be able to put toward a wealth building opportunity like higher education, owning your own home, starting your own business, really looking to provide the opportunity for financial resources for families over a long-term investment. What's really interesting here, that despite the fact that baby bonds programs are very new, there is research that shows that if a baby bonds program had been started in the mid-90s, that we would have seen a decrease in the racial wealth gap, that Black households would have seen a 15.9 wealth increase. So we really believe that this policy has the opportunity to narrow that racial wealth gap. What's interesting here too is that though the opportunity at the federal level has stagnated. We've recently seen states and localities pick this up. Last year, Connecticut became the first state to implement a baby bonds program in July of 2021. Washington, D.C. has also implemented their own program, which was kicked off in August. There are a handful of 5 or 6 states all across the country that have legislation during their legislative sessions right now, taking up baby bonds. And though Indiana is not one of them, we'd love to work with folks and advocates on the ground like yourselves to see if we can build opportunity for a program like this. I do want to emphasize, because baby bonds are particularly interested in closing long-term wealth gaps and really looking at building wealth opportunities for families. We see this as a complementary program or policy to other programs like the child tax credit and other cash assistance programs. This is not supplementary of that. We know that families, particularly BIPOC low-income families, need access to resources now, and baby bonds are a longer-term investment. And so with that said, I'm going to dive into some conversations that we're having through a landscape analysis to understand how we can help support guaranteed income pilots and states and localities picking this up. We know that there are almost 50 pilots and programs all across the country, including one in Gary, Indiana, that ended last year. We participated in a very targeted program, undocumented Latinx workers in East LA that were left out of other COVID relief programs. We were providing $500 to just to give a majority of the families were, or the majority of the household were Latinx. Most of them were non-citizens, most of them were undocumented. The participants primarily made up mariachi musicians, street vendors, and folks that didn't have access to the types of small business and other COVID relief programs that other families would have had access to. So just really quickly, the participants they had lower on average credit scores, they had things, most of them to any type of financial institutions, were underbanked households. But really just to give a picture of what the money was going to, most of them went to work-related businesses, things like clothes, their food carts, gas to get to work. $500 is not a significant amount of money per month, but it was enough to be able to ensure that families were able to maintain their businesses in this short period of time. We saw really interesting deep connections between health and wealth by showing that after families had access to this resource, they saw general improvements in their physical and mental health, their quality of life improved, knowing they had a small safety net to fall back on. These households were able to pay down debts. Per our research around debts, a lot of that came from loan from families or friends, credit cards, medical debt, and though we don't see a significant increase because it was a short period of time, we know that if these were longer term, more sustainable policies, we would continue that these trends would maintain. And just a quick picture, as I already mentioned, the majority of participants saw a reduce in stress and improved mental health. They were able to cover these expenses, pay down debts, and just saw a general and overall improvement in their financial situations. As I mentioned, we are deeply invested in understanding the best ways to tackle and promote pilots and programs, policies across the country, like cash assistance and guaranteed income. And I think that's all I have for back over to you. And if there's any questions, please feel free.
Thank you so much, Alejandra, for all of that great information. And thank you to all of our presenters today. I really appreciate you all taking the time to come on to really talk to us about asset building opportunities and giving us all of this great info to enhance the work that we do every day. Now is the time for questions. If anyone has any questions, feel free to come off of mute and ask them. To begin, I know that Marshawn dropped a question in here for you, Alejandra, and it says, how are baby bonds different from individual development accounts, or are they baby bond-esque?
Two years into the pandemic and I can't get myself off mute. Sorry about that. Yeah, so IDAs or child savings accounts, or all of these different ways that we provide investments in kids are all kind of in the same family, but baby bonds are a particular investment directly from the government. There are no requirements for families to match those savings. There's an opportunity for the government to invest directly in the families and kids that need it most. The lowest wealth families, particularly BIPOC families, to close these wealth gaps. So the biggest difference is that families do not pay into the accounts themselves. These are government invested funds. But there are similarities and there are overlapping ideas that happen. There are many cities looking at this as kind of overlapping policies, recognizing that this is an opportunity that we invest in families doesn't necessarily have to be one specific way. But at Prosperity Now, we really are showing that if we're trying to focus on closing the racial wealth gap, that if a priority is ensuring that BIPOC low-income kids have access to higher education, home ownership, small business creation, all of these things that we know drive wealth building opportunities, racial wealth gap, the best way to do that is for governments to invest directly in those kids, in those families, to close racial wealth gaps. That families should not have to and can't be the only supporter of their kids in these instances.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions for any of our guests?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Jeff Stant. I'm the Executive Director of the Indiana Forest Alliance, and we're probably pretty new to this crowd. I've been following and taking notes, and I'm interested in knowing whether the Midwest Asset Building Conference that Brian Rakovitis was talking about, when they talk about infrastructure and new ideas in that regard, would the conference be a place where an organization like ours, which is promoting the idea of trying to conserve green infrastructure in the cities, particularly in a city like Indianapolis, where there is such a large part of the population that doesn't have adequate access to parks and forests, public forests, is that an investment? I mean, that's not, perhaps thought of as something that should be first order priority, but Indianapolis has been kind of not dealing with this for so long that now there's a pretty stark disparity in access to parks and green space in much of the city. And we have serious heat islands also in these same areas. And so I'm wondering, is a presentation that would address the concept of investing in green infrastructure as an equity initiative, something that the conference would be really interested in, or would that be a bit of a stretch?
Yeah, great question. No, it definitely wouldn't be a stretch. In the 2019 conference, we had one, maybe two conferences or sessions that did focus on green energy investment, infrastructure development, and there's a lot of arguments to be made around sort of, the benefits to the community. I mean, thinking about, having these assets there, enrich the larger community. There was, I think the one that this was focused on was more around like internet and access and things like that. So I think we definitely welcome all sorts of opportunities. So I think if you feel like there's an angle there, obviously the focus is asset building for the conference, but I think as long as you tie it back to the main theme, we'll definitely take a look and entertain it.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Awesome. Does anyone else have any other questions? If not, then I'm going to pick on Marie Beeson for just a second. Tomorrow, Prosperity Indiana is hosting our annual summit, and I know some folks on the call may be registered, but some folks may not. So Marie, if you wouldn't mind letting us know how, for the folks who aren't registered, they may be able to participate in some way.
We would love to have folks be a part of the summit. Thanks for throwing me under the bus, Natalie. Just kidding. No, we've got a great lineup of speakers. We're going to start the day with Reverend Starsky Wilson, who did some amazing work at the time of the Michael Brown shooting in Missouri, and is now executive director of the Children's Defense Fund, talking about creating an equitable economy for all ages. It's going to be a great inspirational keynote. And then we have 12 really fascinating sessions in the programs, policy, public-private investments, and performance track, very much similar to the asset funding framework. So it's nice to see that we're on the same page. Thank you. And then we're going to close the summit with a call to action with Kara Herring, who is the state of Indiana's Chief Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Officer, and Bill Taft with National LISC, talking about how we can move forth to build an equitable economy for all Hoosiers. So it's going to be a great day, all virtual. If you go to the PI website, there is a registration link. I believe registrations are still being accepted and processed, but if you do want to join, please join as soon as we get off this call so we can prepare and have you be a part of the session. That fill your need and time, Natalie?
Yes, thanks so much,
Okay.
Marie. And again, there's a link in the chat to get more information about tomorrow's summit. And yes, it is virtual, so you can join from anywhere if you do decide to sign up. Thank you all for joining today. Really do appreciate everyone on this call. It's been great learning from all of our presenters. As this is my final ANO event, I've been really grateful to work with you all and hope to continue to stay connected in the future. So thanks everyone for joining, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks.